Good evening. It arrived in the middle of an otherwise routine appearance, the kind that usually produced polite headlines and predictable commentary. Cameras were already rolling, microphones already angled just right, when leaned forward slightly, and with a calm that felt almost deliberate, said the words that would ripple across continents within minutes. From what I've seen and heard, nearly 60% of people back home would welcome a fresh start, one that includes us. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to, because the number, 60%, did all the work. Within moments, the clip began to circulate, first among reporters, then across social platforms, then everywhere. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Was it accurate? Was it symbolic? Was it a message? Or was it something far more calculated? Inside palace circles, the response was not immediate outrage. It was silence. A silence so complete, so deliberate, that it became its own form of communication. And that silence spoke volumes. At Kensington, didn't need a briefing to understand the impact. He had already seen the clip, twice. Then a third time, this time without sound, studying every expression, every pause, every subtle shift in tone. She knew exactly what she was doing, he said finally, setting the phone down with controlled precision. Across the room, a senior advisor remained carefully neutral. "Sir, the media response is escalating." William let out a slow breath. "Of course it is," he replied. "Because numbers like that don't just appear out of nowhere." He stood, pacing once across the room before stopping at the window. "It's not the claim," he continued. "It's the implication." The advisor didn't respond. They didn't need to, because the implication was clear. Hako, this wasn't just about popularity. It was about legitimacy. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic was already feeling the aftershock. He hadn't been standing beside Meghan when she said it. He had heard it the same way everyone else had, through the clip that was now looping endlessly on every screen. When he found her later, she was calm, composed, unshaken. "You've seen it," she said before he could speak. Harry nodded. "Yeah," he admitted, "I've seen it." A pause. "You want to tell me where that came from?" Meghan met his gaze steadily. "It came from conversations," she said, "from what people are saying, what they've been saying for a long time." Harry frowned slightly. "That's not the same as 60%, Meg." She didn't flinch. "It's not meant to be exact," she replied. "It's meant to reflect something real." Harry ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. "You know how this is going to be taken?" "Yes," she said simply. "And you're okay with that?" Meghan's answer came without hesitation. "I'm okay with starting a conversation that no one else is willing to have." Back in London, that conversation had already begun, and it was anything but controlled. Commentators dissected the claim from every angle. Analysts debated its meaning. Critics questioned its basis. Supporters amplified it. But the palace? Still nothing. No denial, no clarification, no response. And that silence was starting to feel strategic. At a private meeting later that day, William's frustration had sharpened into something more focused. "This isn't just a remark," he said. "It's positioning." A second advisor nodded cautiously. "There's a perception element, yes." "A perception element?" William repeated, his tone tightening. "It's a direct challenge, wrapped in ambiguity, but a challenge nonetheless." He paused, considering. "And if we respond?" The room went quiet, because that question didn't have an easy answer. Respond and validate the claim by engaging with it. Stay silent and risk letting it take root. Silence can be powerful, one advisor offered carefully. William's expression didn't change. "So can narrative," he replied. Across the ocean, Meghan was watching the reaction unfold in real time, not obsessively, not anxiously, but attentively. She wasn't surprised by the backlash, nor by the support, nor even by the confusion, because in her mind, the number wasn't the point. The reaction was. Harry, however, was less certain. "This could escalate," he said that evening. Meghan looked at him. "It already has," she replied. He shook his head slightly. "I mean, internally, with them." A brief silence. Then Meghan spoke, her voice softer this time. "Maybe it needs to." Harry studied her carefully. "You knew this would hit a nerve." "Yes." "And you did it anyway." "Yes." He exhaled, looking away for a moment. "Why?" Meghan didn't answer immediately. She walked to the window, mirroring a gesture happening thousands of miles away. Then she turned back. "Because silence doesn't change anything," she said, "and neither does pretending that things are fine when they're not." Harry didn't interrupt. "I'm not trying to win anything," she continued. "I'm trying to be honest about what people are already feeling and what no one inside those walls is willing to acknowledge." Back in London, the walls in question felt tighter than ever. By the second day, the pressure had shifted, not outward but inward. Questions were no longer just coming from the media. They were coming from within. Should we say something? Do we correct it? Do we ignore it completely? William listened to every perspective, but his decision remained unchanged. For now, he said, we hold. Hold the line. Hold the silence. Hold the narrative, without engaging. But even he knew that holding wasn't the same as controlling, because outside those walls, the conversation had taken on a life of its own. Some saw Meghan's statement as bold. Others saw it as reckless. Some called it empowering. Others called it provocative. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. It was intentional, and that intention had consequences. By the third day, a new layer had emerged. Not just debate, but division. Public opinion wasn't aligning neatly on one side or the other. It was splitting, shifting, reforming in unpredictable ways. And suddenly, the number, 60%, was no longer just a claim. It was a symbol. Harry felt it too. The shift, the tension, the weight of something larger than a single moment. "This is bigger than we thought," he admitted. Meghan nodded. "I know." He looked at her. "Do you regret it?" For the first time since the statement, Meghan hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of consideration. Then she answered. "No," she said, "but I understand why it matters." That night, the silence from the palace finally broke, but not in the way anyone expected. There was no direct statement, no mention of Meghan, no reference to the number. Instead, there was a carefully worded message, focused on unity, continuity, and service, a reminder of values, a reaffirmation of purpose, and nothing more. It was subtle, measured, strategic, and unmistakably intentional. When Harry read it, he let out a quiet breath. "They're responding," he said. Meghan glanced at the screen. "Not directly." "No," he agreed, "but they are." Across London, William stood watching the same statement being released. It wasn't what some advisors had wanted. It wasn't what critics would expect, but it was deliberate. "We don't engage with numbers," he had said. "We reinforce what matters." But even as the message went out, he knew something had shifted, something that couldn't be undone by silence or statements. The line had been crossed, not with confrontation, but with implication. And once something like that enters the public space, it doesn't disappear. It evolves. Back across the ocean, Meghan sat quietly, her phone resting untouched beside her. Harry joined her a moment later. "They've made their move," he said. She nodded. "And now?" Harry looked at her, searching for an answer. But this time, there wasn't one. Not yet. Because this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something far more complicated, a conversation that couldn't be contained, a narrative that couldn't be fully controlled, and a question that now lingered in every corner of the public imagination. What happens next? For Meghan, the answer wasn't about the number. It was about what the number represented. A shift, a challenge, a possibility. For Harry, it was about balance. between past and future, between loyalty and truth, between silence and voice. And for William, it was about something even more fundamental: stability, continuity, and the quiet understanding that some battles aren't fought with words at all. But even silence has limits, and the longer it holds, the louder everything else becomes. Because one thing was now certain: whether the number was real, symbolic, or somewhere in between, it had already done what it was meant to do. It had changed the conversation. And once a conversation changes, nothing stays the same. The shift didn't happen all at once. It unfolded in layers, subtle at first, then unmistakable. The palace statement, carefully worded and intentionally indirect, had steadied the surface. It reminded people of tradition, of continuity, of the quiet strength that had long defined the institution. But beneath that surface, the conversation Meghan had ignited refused to settle. It moved, it evolved, and most importantly, it spread. Within days, the 60% wasn't just being debated, it was being interpreted. For some, it represented a silent majority finally being acknowledged. For others, it was an overreach, an attempt to shape public perception without evidence. But for everyone, it became a question. Who gets to define the narrative? In California was no longer watching the reaction as an outsider. She was part of it. Every headline, every discussion, every panel analysis circled back to her words, not because they were definitive, but because they were disruptive. And disruption, once introduced, doesn't simply disappear. "You've changed the tone," said one evening, his voice thoughtful rather than critical. Meghan looked up from the notes she'd been reviewing. "I didn't mean to change the tone," she replied. "I meant to change the honesty." Harry gave a faint, almost amused smile. "Same result," he said. She didn't argue with that. But while the conversation outside was expanding, inside the palace, it was tightening. At Kensington had moved from frustration to focus. The initial shock had passed. The silence had been maintained. The statement had been issued. Now came the harder part: what to do next. "This isn't going away," one advisor said during a closed-door briefing. William didn't respond immediately. He already knew that, because the problem wasn't the number anymore. It was what the number had unlocked. "It's not about accuracy," William said finally. "It's about perception." Another advisor nodded. "And perception is shifting." William's expression hardened slightly, not in anger but in recognition. "Then we don't chase it," he said. "We outlast it." Outlast, not confront, not counter. Outlast. But even as the strategy was set, there were signs that not everyone agreed. Quiet concerns began to surface, not publicly, not even formally, but internally. Because the longer the palace remained indirect, the more space the narrative had to grow, and it was growing. Across media platforms, discussions had become more pointed, no longer just about Meghan's statement, but about the broader implications: public trust, institutional transparency, the gap between perception and reality. Some voices defended the palace's restraint. Others questioned whether silence still held the same power it once did. Because in a world that moved faster than tradition, silence could just as easily be interpreted as absence. Back in California, Meghan was beginning to feel that shift more personally, not as pressure, but as responsibility. "What if they're right?" Harry asked quietly one night. Meghan glanced at him. "About what?" "That this opens something we can't control." She held his gaze for a moment. "Then we focus on what we can control," she said. "And what's that?" "Our intent." Harry nodded slowly. But intent, he knew, didn't always shape outcome. The next development came from an unexpected place. Not a statement, not a rebuttal, but a story. A detailed feature began circulating, one that didn't directly challenge Meghan's claim, but instead reframed the conversation entirely. It focused on the work being done quietly behind the scenes, on long-standing commitments, on continuity, service, and duty. It didn't mention Meghan by name, but the contrast was clear. When saw it, he recognized the approach immediately. "This is better," he said. "Not reactive, not defensive, but grounded." Because if Meghan had introduced a number, this introduced a narrative. And narratives, unlike numbers, didn't need to be proven. They needed to be felt. Harry saw it too. "They're shifting the focus," he said, handing the article to Meghan. She read it carefully, her expression thoughtful. "They're reinforcing their position," she replied. "Does it change anything?" Meghan considered that. "No," she said, "but it complicates everything." And she was right. Because now, the conversation wasn't one-sided. It wasn't just about Meghan's claim. It was about two competing visions, both subtle, both strategic, both incomplete on their own. For the public, it created a sense of uncertainty. For the media, it created momentum. But for those at the center of it, it created tension. That tension reached a new level when the next message arrived. This time, it wasn't public. It was private, direct, and impossible to ignore. Harry stared at the screen for a long moment before speaking. "They want to talk," he said. Meghan didn't need to ask who. Her reaction was immediate, but measured. "About what?" Harry exhaled slowly. "About everything." A silence followed, not heavy, but significant. "Do you want to?" Meghan asked. Harry hesitated, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he did. "Yes," he said. Then, after a beat, "But only if it's real this time." Meghan nodded. "Then we make sure it is." Back in London, William stood at the window once again, the same place he always seemed to end up when decisions carried weight. The situation had evolved beyond what anyone had anticipated. It wasn't just about managing perception anymore. It was about addressing reality. "They'll want clarity," an advisor said carefully. William didn't turn around. "Then they'll get it," he replied. The meeting was set. No intermediaries, no distractions, just conversation. When the day arrived, the atmosphere was unlike any before. There was no pretense, no attempt to soften the edges, because everyone understood what was at stake. Meghan spoke first, not with defiance, not with apology, but with intention. "I didn't say that number to provoke," she said. "I said it because something needs to change." The room was still. Then William responded. "And you think this is the way to do it?" Meghan met his gaze. "I think it's a way to start." Harry watched closely, not for conflict, but for honesty. Because that was the only thing that mattered now. "This isn't just about perception," William said. "It's about responsibility." "And responsibility includes listening," Meghan replied. The words hung between them, not as weapons, but as truths, different but equally real. For a moment, it felt like they were standing on opposite sides of something unbridgeable. But then, a shift, small, subtle, but undeniable. "Then let's talk about what that looks like," William said. It wasn't agreement, not yet, but it was something more important, willingness. And willingness, once present, changes everything. Hours later, as the meeting ended, nothing had been fully resolved. No grand conclusions had been reached. No immediate solutions had been agreed upon. But something had happened. The conversation had moved beyond the number, beyond the headlines, beyond the silence. It had become real. That night, as Harry and Meghan sat together in the quiet, the weight of everything that had happened finally settled. "Well?" Harry asked softly. Meghan leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "I think," she said slowly, "we've reached the part where things either change or they don't." Harry nodded. "And which do you think it will be?" Meghan didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked out into the distance, her voice quiet but steady when she finally spoke. That depends on what happens next. And for the first time since the number had been spoken, that answer didn't feel uncertain. It felt possible. Because the real impact of the 60% bombshell wasn't the number itself. It was what it forced everyone to confront: the gap between perception and reality, the tension between silence and voice, and the question no one could ignore anymore: what does the future actually look like? No one had the full answer. Not Meghan, not Harry, not even William. But one thing was clear: the conversation wasn't ending. It was only just beginning. The aftermath of that meeting didn't erupt into headlines. It didn't spill into statements or carefully staged appearances. Instead, it settled into something far more complex and far more revealing: a pause. Not the kind that avoids conflict, but the kind that follows truth. In the days that followed, there was no immediate shift in public tone. The debate still raged. The 60% still lingered in commentary, in opinion pieces, in late-night panels dissecting every angle. But behind the scenes, something had changed. The conversation was no longer abstract. It had faces, voices, direct exchanges that could no longer be filtered through distance or assumption. In California, felt it first, not as relief, but as clarity. For the first time since she had spoken those words, she wasn't wondering how they would be received. She knew. And more importantly, she knew they had landed where they needed to. "You don't seem worried anymore," observed one morning, watching her closely. Meghan set her cup down, considering his words. "I'm not," she said simply. Harry raised an eyebrow. "Not at all." She shook her head gently. "Because it's out there now," she explained. "Not just the number, but everything behind it, and we've said what needed to be said." Harry leaned back slightly. "And now?" Meghan's answer came without hesitation. "Now we see who's willing to act on it." Across the ocean, in London, was arriving at the same realization, from the opposite direction. The meeting hadn't resolved anything neatly. It hadn't erased tension, but it had stripped away something far more significant: distance. "They're not speaking in headlines anymore," one advisor noted quietly during a briefing. William nodded. "No," he said, "they're speaking directly." And that, he knew, changed the rules. Because direct conversation doesn't allow for easy interpretation. It doesn't leave space for narrative to fill in the gaps. It demands clarity, and clarity can be uncomfortable. "What's our position now?" another voice asked. William paused. For the first time since the 60% moment, the answer wasn't immediate. Because the strategy of silence, the one that had worked for so long, no longer felt sufficient on its own, not when the conversation had moved beyond it. "We stay grounded," he said finally, "but we don't ignore what's being said." It was a subtle shift, but a real one. Back in California, Harry felt that shift almost instinctively. "They're adjusting," he said one evening, scrolling through the latest coverage. Meghan glanced over. "How?" "They're not pushing back the same way," he explained. "It's less about defending, more about responding." Meghan nodded slowly. "That's new." Harry looked at her. "Does that change anything for you?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked to the window again, the place where so many of her thoughts seemed to settle. Then she turned back. "It changes the possibility," she said. Possibility. It wasn't certainty. It wasn't resolution. But it was something they hadn't had in a long time. The next step came quietly. A follow-up message. Not dramatic, not urgent, but intentional. Harry read it twice before handing the phone to Meghan.